Again, thanks everyone for logging in. This is Brian Termail. I'm the spokesperson for the Associated General Contractors of America. We've got a briefing for you guys today, both from AGC's Chief Economist, Ken Simonson, and from our partners and friends over at Procore. We've conducted a 8th version of our coronavirus survey of our members, looking at the impacts of the pandemic on our members, and Ken will walk us through that. And Procore has been tracking almost real-time data on the performance of the industry, and have wonderful data that's available by state and for some metro areas. And we've got Chris from Procore on with us as well, and he'll talk after Ken. Just a few nuts and bolts before we launch right into the presentation. Everything we're talking about we'll be emailing out to media. We're also posting everything live on the AGC website. So you can go ahead and log in at agc.org, and then just go to the news update, and you can find all the information right there. With that, I'm going to do two things. I'm going to hand things over to Ken Simonson. Now I'm going to turn my camera off just so we're not distracting, but I'll still be here, and I'll be running Ken through the slides. So with that, AGC's Chief Economist, Ken Simonson. Ken, you're up.
Hello, everyone, and thank you, Brian, for that introduction. The commercial construction industry has endured several tumultuous months as the coronavirus pandemic has led to lockdowns of large swaths of the economy. And while construction was rightly considered essential in most states and allowed to continue operating, the industry has not been immune. Since the middle of March, AGC of America has been tracking the impacts of the pandemic on the industry by conducting a series of surveys of our members. Our intent is to understand how this historic event and the resulting stay-at-home orders have affected demand for construction, the supply of materials, the size of the workforce, and also what our members have made use of in the way of legislation that's passed so far and what they feel is needed. These surveys also allow us to track the impacts of the government relief efforts, the reopening, and other signs of a possible rebound. Today, we're releasing the 8th edition of our coronavirus survey based on responses we've collected during the past week. The new survey shows how lockdowns and declining economic activity hurt firms during the past few months. And I'm going to have Brian put up the summary slide on the survey and then take you through some comparative results. The next slide shows an awful lot of data on one slide. Don't feel you have to get your pencils out and copy it all down. As Brian said, the full set of results will be sent to you. It's also available on the agc.org website. And I do want to show how things have changed over the weeks. While there are signs, the new survey results show how lockdowns and declining economic activities have hurt many firms during the past few months. And while there are signs the industry has stabilized and even begun to expand again, the results also make it clear that the sector's recovery faces many headwinds. 44% of responding firms reported having at least one project halted or canceled between the start of the pandemic and the end of May. And the next slide shows how these trends have evolved over the weeks. The orange line shows projects that were halted. The number of halts has been coming down, and that's a sign of how projects have finished up, but also how governors have started to relax orders that in some states did shut down projects. Unfortunately, the line that had started below that, cancellations of upcoming projects, has moved up considerably. And as a result, we are looking at far more projects being canceled going forward. 23% report having projects canceled that were scheduled to start this month. Even more troubling, 15% of firms had projects canceled that were scheduled to begin in August or later. 24% of the early cancellations were ordered by public officials in places like New York and Washington State. But the rest of the current project halts and all of the future ones are because owners no longer want to proceed with the project as economic conditions deteriorate. The coronavirus is also having an impact on the projects that have not yet been canceled or delayed. 1 in 4 firms report that construction material shortages, likely caused by economic lockdowns and disruptions to global trade, are causing delays on ongoing projects. A quarter report labor shortages are delaying projects as workers stay home because they are sick from or worried about the coronavirus. And 14% of firms report delays caused by a lack of government action on workers, such as inspection and permit reviews. The next slide does show the various reasons that firms have reported there have been delays or shutdowns, and it does have one piece of good news. That's the orange line, showing that in the latest survey, only 10% of respondents report delays caused by shortage of PPE, personal protective equipment, such as masks, sanitizing equipment, and gloves. And that's down from almost 40% just 2 months ago. The pandemic has also had a dramatic and somewhat dynamic impact on construction headcounts. For instance, 25% of firms report they had furloughed or terminated employees in May or earlier, but only 16% reported adding employees during the same time frame. So far this month, in contrast, 8% of firms report furloughing or terminating employees, while 21% report adding employees. This probably reflects the benefits of many states lifting their economic lockdowns and the help provided by the Paycheck Protection Program loans, which over 80% of firms report having received. Moving forward, only 12% of firms report they anticipate needing to furlough or terminate employees in the next 4 weeks. Meanwhile, 17% report adding employees in the next 4 weeks. Next slide, please, Brian. The problem that firms have been facing in the past for delayed deliveries has also eased somewhat. For several cycles of our survey, about half the firms said that they had been notified, or their subcontractors had been notified, that some deliveries would be delayed or even canceled. And that percentage has shrunk notably in the last survey, down to 38%. Yet even as more construction firms predict they will expand during the next several weeks compared to those who expect to shrink, many firms do not expect demand to return to normal anytime soon. Indeed, 42% of firms said they don't expect demand will recover to pre-corona levels for at least 4 months, and most of those firms expect it will take more than 6 months to return to normal. The next slide shows how few firms have reported new or expanded projects. This percentage has held very steady at about 1/5 right through the latest survey. In fact, we think that much more will be needed from the federal government to keep things going. The national survey results offer a clear picture of how the industry has been impacted by the coronavirus and whether and how many firms expect to recover. But it's important to note that pandemic's impacts do vary by region. For instance, firms in the South and West are twice as likely as firms in the Northeast to say that they expect to add workers in the next 4 weeks. The disparate impacts of the pandemic become even clearer when we look at the data from our partners at Procore. The construction technology firm is able to track by week the impact of the coronavirus on a state-by-state level. Indeed, they are even able to show how the pandemic affected the construction industry in several major cities. We've asked Christopher Longiza, Procore's Senior Director of Business Development, to walk us through their data so we can see which areas were harder hit than others by the pandemic and where the recovery is strongest. So I'm going to throw Brian a curve and ask him to skip the rest of my slides, move on to Procore's, and turn things over to Chris.
Absolutely. Thanks a lot, Ken. Really appreciate it. And thanks for having us on so we could share some of this information. Brian, you can go ahead and go to the next slide. So what we've done at Procore is we've been able to collect a lot of information about what's actually happening on projects in near real time. And this is because our customers are working with their collaborators, those who work on the job sites, to collect daily logs, basically collecting how many people are working on those projects and for how long they're there. So today, what I'm going to walk you through is very quickly just refresh your memory around the shelter-in-place timeline, and then how we're measuring those worker hours and how it has progressed week to week as we've gone through this pandemic. We'll then break that down a bit further by the states, and so you can see how each individual region or state was affected. We'll talk about some of the different business sizes and how that they have been affected and also how they have recovered. Similarly, we'll talk about different project types such as infrastructure versus non-infrastructure. And then lastly, some of our newest data around whether or not major metropolitan areas, how they have dealt with construction throughout this pandemic. You can go ahead and go to the next slide, Brian. So as a reminder, just wanted to refresh your memory, and I'm going to show you a map on the next slide that's going to tell you a little bit about the shelter-in-place timeline. As many of you know, the country went into shelter-in-place across 4 different cohorts, starting the week of 3/15 with early states like California, Illinois, and New Jersey, and then some of the later states coming in either the week of April 5th or some deciding not to put in place shelter-in-place orders at all. So as we go to the next slide, you'll see how over this timeline, the number of worker hours measured on projects was affected by these shelter-in-place orders. We'll use March 1st as our baseline, where nearly 14 million worker hours were measured during that time frame, which equates to around 400,000 workers that were measured across hundreds of thousands of projects that we collect information for on Procore. You'll notice that the decline was pretty well in line with those shelter-in-place orders from that March 15th, then March 22nd, and 29th. As we moved through those weeks, we had a pretty steady decline until we hit a low of about 17%, 11.6 million worker hours measured the week of April 5th. Now, as payment and protection program payments came into play, and then we started to reach some of those earliest reopenings, we started to see those numbers climb and move back towards what was basically a pre-COVID high the last week, the week of May 10th at about 14.2 million workers on the job site. What's important to note here is that there's expected seasonal growth during this period as well. So this is construction season. Many projects are getting started during the March to May timeline because they are coming into the better weather portions of the year. You will notice a pretty sharp fall off the week of May 24th, obviously, because we had a shortened week that week with only 4 work days versus 5 due to Memorial Day, and then measured the last week of May into the first week of June at 14.4 million workers, which was actually about 2% above where we were previously. Now, we wanted to go, and you can go to the next slide, Brian, and talk a little bit about how this was affecting people regionally. How did it affect you on a state-by-state level? So we dove into the data based on where those projects were actually located. And as I show you this next map, you'll see a progression of time throughout these weeks on how it affected each state individually. Brian, you can go to the next slide. So as we hit that first shelter-in-place order, you'll notice that California dropped pretty significantly, down 26%, almost immediately. And then Brian, go ahead and keep flipping. We're going to notice that the hot spots where the coronavirus were, things like New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, started to drop off, and the correspondence between where the reduction in worker hours was happening was also corresponding to where the hot spots of coronavirus was hitting the hardest in the country, similarly with Washington. Now, if you keep going to the next week, you'll see that in the week of March 29th, still more of the same. Hotspots continue. Louisiana becomes a bit of a hotspot, and decreases in construction worker hours are continuing there. The southern part of the country seems to be a little bit more resilient, as they had somewhat relaxed standards on whether or not projects could continue to work forward and continue to move forward. Brian, if you can go to the next week, you'll notice that in that first week of April, we see a little bit more of a dip in those hot spots, but still the South holding a little bit strong. And even some of those states where that construction season is coming around are starting to see increases in worker hours because either they had no shelter-in-place orders or very, very relaxed shelter-in-place orders. Brian, you can go to the next week as well. So then we're going to skip forward a few weeks here to April 26th, which was where some of the first reopenings started to happen. And you will notice, looking at this chart again, that the South is already starting to see levels above or at where the pre-COVID highs were. We're starting to see a little bit of recovery in some of those hot spots because some of those states were starting to deem more and more types of project essential, construction projects essential, and still some recoveries up in the Washington area as well. As you go to the next week and we move into May, you'll start to see how the progress of more and more states start to come back online. More and more of them are reaching at levels above where their pre-COVID high was. Go ahead and go to the next week, Brian. You'll just start to notice now we're becoming a little bit more pale in color. We're getting really close to where we were for the majority of the country. Still some of those hotspots, Massachusetts, New York, West Virginia, those are still having some of the issues where projects are not getting restarted. And then next week, Brian, May 17th, still, now we're seeing a lot more blue. We're seeing states come online and actually be above those pre-COVID highs. Keep in mind, construction season, there should be some increase in workers during this time of the year as well. And then if you go ahead and go to the next slide, we have the week of Memorial Day, so a decrease basically across the country as a whole. And then our last week of May 31st, you'll notice that, I believe it is 34 states across the United States that are above or basically equal to where they were pre-COVID as well. Now, we really also wanted to understand how this affected different business sizes. So Brian, if you want to go ahead and go to the next slide, we dove into the data and we started to separate our customers into 3 batches. Now on the next slide, you'll see that we separated them into small, medium, and large businesses. We can give you information about how we separated the sizes of these companies, but what you'll notice is what we had as a hypothesis and what the industry was telling us is that small businesses were more affected than others. The good news, however, is that you'll notice that they've made almost a full recovery. As we're looking at that last week of May 31st, they're basically back up to pre-COVID levels. Now, you'll notice that large and medium businesses are above those pre-COVID levels, as they probably should be for this time of year with construction season, but they were able to kind of close that gap, and you'll see that there hasn't been much of a difference as they've recovered from those medium and large businesses. They're becoming closer and closer together as they become more and more accustomed to working through a post-COVID job site. You can go to the next slide, Brian. The next piece we wanted to dive into was we had some hypothesis about what types of projects would have been more affected than others. And so we wanted to divide our projects into infrastructure and non-infrastructure. The hypothesis was that infrastructure projects would be a little bit more resilient than those non-infrastructure style projects. But unfortunately, as you'll see on the next slide, basically every project type was significantly affected by COVID. It didn't matter whether it was in the infrastructure sector or not. The statistical difference by the number of worker hours between these was very, very small. And you'll even notice in the latest weeks that they're basically on top of each other from a percentage-wise of a decrease or increase from the pre-COVID high. We did think, though, that there was a little bit more here, so we wanted to subdivide. And on the next slide, you'll see that we subdivided those infrastructure projects into 3 different categories: transportation, healthcare, and energy versus those non-infrastructure projects. You will notice that early on, staying a little bit more resilient, we were seeing workers being put on those conversion projects for things like stadiums and arenas and convention centers into hospitals, but they've dropped off a little bit from there. Energy has made a pretty strong recovery, and they are now at pre-COVID highs as well, along with pretty much the non-infrastructure type projects as well getting back on board. There is some hypothesis around the fact that some projects are trying to catch up for the lost time, so they are also putting more workers on the job site to try and close those schedule gaps to get projects finished up. Now, the last part in our newest set of data is we started to subdivide this into some of the major metropolitan areas. And we did this based on the CVSAs that represent those major metropolitan areas. So if you flip to the next slide, you'll notice that you're seeing the percentage of change on a week-over-week basis of really 8 different metropolitan areas: Chicago, Dallas, Houston, Los Angeles, Miami, New York, San Francisco, and Seattle. You can very clearly see from this chart that New York, San Francisco, and Seattle were the hardest hit, and New York has made the slowest recovery. Now, New York did reopen construction for non-essential projects, and early indications are already showing us from our data that they're making a strong comeback in worker hours this week already. But you'll notice that some other states and some other areas, such as Dallas and Los Angeles, were not nearly as affected as other parts in other metropolitan areas of the country. Similarly, in Miami, where in South Florida, anecdotally talked to a lot of my former colleagues, municipalities did a good job of putting in place standards for projects to stay open, and also did a good job of working to get inspections done on the job site, whether it be remotely or through documentation, so that projects can keep moving. Now, as we flip to the next slide, you're going to see a graphical representation of this, and we split this up into 3 regions, really the West, the Central, and the East Coast. And so you're seeing a comparison here of Seattle, San Francisco, and LA. And as the data showed previously, LA remained pretty close to their pre-COVID high throughout the pandemic, whereas Seattle and San Francisco were significantly affected. Seattle being the most affected early, and then also making a strong recovery and closing that gap up to where we are today. Now, as we look at the central part of the country on the next slide, you'll notice that mid-central metro, you're seeing Dallas, Houston, and Chicago. Dallas stayed above the line basically the entire time during COVID once we adjusted. And then areas like Chicago were staying a little bit below, but have made recoveries. And then we have our we have our Memorial Day drop there as well. Now, Houston has experienced somewhat of a drop off and didn't do a lot of shutdowns early on. So we're not exactly sure what's happening in Houston to understand why they're continuing to see a drop in number of workers on the job site there. We're doing a little bit of research there as well. Now, lastly, we'll look at the East Coast, and you'll understand Miami and New York. So Miami, as I mentioned early on, put in place procedures to keep projects moving, and they stayed pretty close to those pre-COVID highs in the measurement of number of worker hours. New York, obviously, severe drop off, lots of projects closed down, and is starting to recover as they opened up more and more project types and people could get back to work. We do expect to see a significant increase in this now that projects of non-essential types are being allowed to reopen in the future coming weeks. So Brian, if you go ahead and flip to the last slide, all of this information is available on our website, procore.com/COVID insights. You can see all these charts and graphs and dive into them a lot more in detail. In addition, if you have questions about this data or want to reuse this data, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at press@procore.com. And then lastly, for some of the backup data around where we were getting those core-based statistical areas, you can visit the sites of huduser.gov and census.gov to identify what's included in those metropolitan areas as well. At this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Ken for some closing remarks.
All right. Well, thank you, Chris. This is really helpful. I think this Procore data is a valuable new addition to what Census and Bureau of Labor Statistics have been putting out, and AGC's own analyses. Tomorrow, for instance, the Bureau of Labor Statistics will tell us how much construction employment changed in each state from April to May, and AGC will have a release ranking all the states by the percentage and numerical change over the previous 1 month and 12-month periods. This is actually ahead of it. It obviously doesn't have the complete industry coverage, but it does focus on the non-residential side of construction. So that can be quite different from housing construction, which is included in the BLS numbers. And I'm looking forward to seeing further iterations of the Procore data. Our new survey results and Procore's data make it clear that a speedy recovery for the construction industry is far from a foregone conclusion. In fact, our members have made it clear that they are counting on additional federal help to improve demand for construction and make it easier for them to bring workers back onto payrolls. 57% of respondents report they are counting on Congress and the Trump administration to enact liability reform that would protect firms that are complying with coronavirus safety protocols from litigation. 34% of firms are hoping Congress will boost funding for all types of infrastructure work to offset expected private sector decline in private sector demand for construction. That's going beyond the surface transportation reauthorization that we are expecting. And 29% hope Congress will provide immediate funding to state transportation departments to help prevent project delays as a result of lost revenue from the pandemic and near total collapse in fuel tax collection in late March through early May. This has caused a number of state DOTs to postpone the bid lettings, the awards of highway projects that normally would be taking place at this season. Many firms are hoping that Congress will not extend the unemployment supplements that are currently set to expire at the end of July. Notably, 34% of firms that recalled employees who had been laid off report having workers refuse to return to their payrolls because of those unemployment supplements. While the measure clearly helped while much of the country was ordered to stay at home, extending the supplement is likely to make it harder for many employers to bring people back onto payrolls. Our survey results and Procore's data make clear that many of the immediate economic impacts of the coronavirus have passed. As a result, cancellations are down and hiring is up at least a bit. But while the immediate crisis appears to have passed, we are just now beginning to appreciate some of the longer-term economic impacts of the pandemic. Without additional help from Congress, the few gains this industry has made during the past few weeks will likely prove fleeting. Once the money from the Paycheck Protection Program loans is used up, for instance, companies that have been expecting further private projects are likely to have to start laying off employees unless there is something else taking the place of those canceled projects. That's why the Associated General Contractors of America will continue to push Congress and the administration to enact the kind of long-term economic recovery measures this industry needs to truly rebound from the coronavirus. With that, we'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. Brian?
Thanks, Ken. And we already have a few questions, but for those of you who haven't punched in, just use if you go to the control bar on your Zoom app here, there's a Q&A option. And when you open that up, you can type in questions and we'll try and field them. And we'll try and get to all the questions that have come in. In fact, while folks are maybe typing some additional questions, we do have a few already in the can. And I'll start with one from Jeff Yoder's over at E&R. He wants to know, his question is, worker hours look fairly consistent, up or down about 5-7% in states that never had stay-at-home orders like Nebraska and Iowa. Any correlation to just consistent numbers in the states that have never had a stay-at-home order? So I think he's asking there, is that kind of consistent with what you'd expect in a state, in a normal market, or, is there a distinction between stay-at-home order and not on construction?
Yeah, I think there's definitely some consistency in seeing that states that had stay-at-home orders were definitely seeing a significantly larger decrease in worker hours. What needs to be considered is that even if construction was deemed essential, that a lot of the projects that are still happening may happen in, occupied buildings, things like office towers, tenant renovations, existing facilities. So even though there may not have been a stop on construction work, some owners may have chosen to pause work in those states. So we do expect to see some of those slowdowns no matter what on those project locations. So I think it is fairly consistent where there were no shelter-in-place orders or hard stops on construction work, that we're still going to see those declines in those areas and those states that did not put in shelter-in-place orders, because there are going to be owners that are going to drive projects being slowed down or stopped, or workers from coming onto their campuses to protect either their employees or other folks as well that might be slowed down.
Let me add just a little bit of technical gloss on this. The Procore data does depend on their own database of contractors. And so that does vary week by week, how many contractors are using their platform, whether they're adding clients to the base or whether a project has finished up. There may be a gap before a contractor starts putting in worker hours for the next project. Also, in many states, seasonality is very important, particularly since we're comparing to March 1st, which was just the beginning of the spring hiring season in some states. It was even ahead of that then. So depending where a state is, you may see a large increase every year between the 1st of March and the end of May. That's why I'm looking forward to building up Procore, building up this database, hopefully being able to get some historical information about what's happened in past years between March and May, or the entire annual cycle. But I agree with Chris that it is quite indicative of, has quite a connection between where the stay-at-home orders were more severe and where they have since been lessened. So I think no single data source captures it all. This really adds a lot of color to what's been happening at the state and even the metro market level.
Thanks, Chris and Ken. Next question comes from Sean. He wants to know, can you tell us a little bit more about how transportation infrastructure work is faring? Is it recovering more slowly as states deal with tax revenue fall off from COVID-19, or is it picking up? Do we have any data that sort of gives us insight into that?
Well, I'll start. I think we heard early on that there were a few states, Florida was kind of the #1 example of states that were encouraging contractors to work more hours. They were allowed to close more lanes on heavily used roads that suddenly had a near total drop in traffic, or close lanes for more hours. Offsetting that, you had Pennsylvania shut down absolutely everything in the first few weeks. And that included not just the PennDOT, but also the Pennsylvania Turnpike Authority, a very big customer for construction in that state. And we had similar variation around the country. A few states, I think, were able to put projects out for bid earlier, but that has been replaced, I suspect, more and more by the states saying, wow, look at the drop in gas tax receipts or toll receipts that we've had. We're going to have to postpone or even cancel some projects that we plan to put out to bid. So you do have some offsetting patterns going state by state.
Yeah, and just to add a little bit of color to that from the data that we have, we did see that transportation got hit very hard early, a lot of that having to do with some of those states shutting down it completely. We then saw a fairly decent increase in those transportation projects. And it's not just roadways, like transportation encompasses a lot of different types of projects that are related to the transportation industry. So we saw a little bit of a peak coming after that because some of those states accelerated some projects. They'd given them rights to go ahead and work on more of those projects. And just to back up what Ken is saying is we are starting to see again a little bit of a drop off on the number of worker hours that are showing up in the transportation space, because we think some of those projects that were expected to be let may not be actually being let, and they're not actually getting started on some of those projects, especially in states where they are relaxing or have removed shelter-in-place orders and people are getting back to work and getting back on the roads. They don't maybe have as easy access to go and work more hours or shut down more lanes and things like that that we're seeing on project types.
And Brian, I think this indicates why we feel, and our members feel, it is so important that Congress act right away on two pieces of legislation affecting highway construction. One is the request by the state DOTs through their association, AASHTO, to have Congress backfill $50 billion of lost gas and other highway tax revenue. And second, to make sure that the 5-year Highway and Surface Transportation Authorization Bill also covers transit projects known as the FAST Act, which expires September 30th, that Congress reauthorize that legislation with a really substantial boost in funding and lessening of the strings that keep projects from going ahead for so long. Get that done before September 30th. Unfortunately, over the last couple of decades, Congress has continually kicked the can down the road, to use their tired expression. And sometimes it's been as long as almost 2 years before the full reauthorization takes place. We really need to see both of those pieces of legislation done in the next few weeks to keep contractors from having to lay off a lot of employees.
Gotcha. Rebecca wants to know, what are your expectations for the Miami market looking at the next 90 days or so? And I don't know if either of you want to tackle that one.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have a crystal ball, but I can tell you what the data is at least showing us to date and what we're expecting to see as a continued growth in those worker hours. Miami not as susceptible to winter conditions, so it doesn't have to deal with that seasonality. And we have seen a pretty steady growth since the week of April 5th. Basically worker hours gradually increasing from a week-to-week basis. So our expectations is, and the reason that we've only issued data through May 31st, the week of May 31st is, if for those of you who are unfamiliar, contractors are notorious for not necessarily doing daily logs on a daily basis, but they catch up on them the week after, right? So it takes a week or so for the data to actually stabilize. So from data that I've actually seen on the back end, we are still continuing to see that growth in worker hours and continue to see that grow. So more people going back to the job site, projects picking up either to close. What is probably the bigger question, and where we're trying to look at some other data sets that we have, is what is going to happen past that 90 days? What is going to happen into next year? What's happening with the project starts? What's happening with those project cancellations? And we are doing a lot of research around that, but we don't have any data that we're ready to present, basically immediately for you on that at the moment.
Miami is an example of how important local data can be, in fact, hyper-local data. I was reading during March and April how individual municipalities, even smaller than Miami Beach, say Sunny Isles, was adopting its own rules compared to the statewide or the larger metro directives. So some things may have very much depended on which municipality you were in at a given time. But I do think that Miami, the CBSA, as Chris refers to it, the core-based statistical area, which is similar to the definition of the metro area, is one that will be probably near its peak now, unless we get some substantial new federal funding that will enable new projects on the state and local side to go ahead. I do think that private owners in Miami, as in most of the country, are going to be very cautious about seeing whether there is still as much demand as they hoped there had been earlier for residential, for hotel and other travel related, certainly for retail, and for cultural and recreational kind of spending. All of those, I think, are very vulnerable to not just the state of the coronavirus itself, but the financial condition of project owners, developers, investors.
Thanks, guys. Another question, and this kind of ties right into your last comment there, Ken. A lot of the Procore's worker hour data shows a drop around Memorial Day, but some metros have already recovered more than others from the time off. Is there any insight into if this is a sign that some of these metros are seeing the end of pre-COVID projects and that the May drops may be more than just Memorial Day time off? In other words, are there some metro areas where people have worked through their backlog and we're now into the longer term impacts of the coronavirus?
Chris, you want to say something about that?
Sure. I think it's a little bit hard for us to tell that whether or not those projects are ending, and that's why we're seeing a little bit of a drop off. We would expect to see a 20% decline anyways, right? 4 days versus 5 days. And in some cases, we actually saw less than that. So the fact that the week coming back afterwards hasn't fully reached up to that number is a little bit less concerning because of the comment that I made earlier about people catching up on paperwork and tagging hours. A lot of people do timesheets on a bi-weekly basis as well, and that's information that we're collecting. So depending on when they're actually putting that data in, it might look a little bit different a week from now as well. So I'm less concerned about what's happening the week after Memorial Day, more concerned about what's happening going forward. And as those projects fall off the backlog and as projects get finished, what is going to be the next place for them to go?
Great. Thanks. Next question is, any data on jobs shutting down for a day or two, then reopening due to COVID? This is obviously job-specific outbreak information. Do we have any data on that? One of the questions we got asked.
Yeah, we don't have anything to share yet. I think what we have been tracking internally is number of delay notices based on COVID outbreak, words like that show up in those daily logs. We don't have anything that we're publicly available to share at this point, but obviously we saw a significant increase in those delays being logged since the beginning of COVID. Some of them are still tagged as delayed, right, because they have not returned yet all to completely. So it's going to take a little bit of time frame, I think, before we end up seeing exactly how long they were delayed, how long they were captured as being shut down, and then what were the reasons that they were being shut down. Getting a level of granularity on what the actual reason for the shutdown, whether it be a local ordinance of shelter in place or a statewide ordinance of shut in place versus an outbreak, will take a little bit more data research, and we just haven't done anything to be able to present that publicly right now.
Well, Brian, as you know, many AGC members engaged in safety stand downs to educate their employees as to the proper procedures to comply with CDC or state or local health regulations for what made safe practices on job sites. So that was not a case of workers staying away from the job for a day. The site probably wasn't shut down for the entire day, but it would have affected the amount of work that was done on a given day. But I'm sure companies more than made up for that by having more employees who were able to stay safe and healthy as a result of getting those lessons learned or reinforced.
One question is, we've got someone on the participant who's curious what our analysis is of what's going on in Michigan, right? Michigan was one of the states with one of the longer stay-at-home orders and shutdowns. What are we seeing from Michigan, and do we have any does the data that we've collected so far tell us anything about what to expect moving forward?
Well, I think Michigan is always a special case when you're discussing the economy, because the auto industry is still such an important part of the Michigan economy, the Michigan workforce, much more than in most other states, although it's a very high percentage also in Ohio and Indiana and in many regions within the South, sub-state areas within the South. And in Michigan, automakers either shut down or they converted from producing autos to producing ventilators and other specialized items. But certainly there was a huge hit to the amount of ongoing economic activity in manufacturing plants. I think the governor took a relatively strict line about what was considered essential activity outside of construction. It did affect construction perhaps more than other states also. And you had a very significant outbreak early on in the Detroit area, which I think meant that Michigan had to deal much more with the coronavirus impact than some other states. So all of those things probably helped depress the amount of ongoing construction activity early on. But as I watched those maps go by in Chris's presentation, yeah, Michigan was one of the 5 or 6 states that had the deepest drop in construction employment in the first 5 weeks up through April 5th or so, along with New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, Washington. All of those had very severe restrictions on general economic activity, and most of them specifically on construction. Massachusetts also was quite negative. That was, I think, limited to Boston and Cambridge, where the mayors went well beyond what the governor wanted, but those happened to be cities that had a huge amount of the state's construction hours. So anyway, back with Michigan, yes, you had a really steep drop and a good deal of comeback once things reopened. Michigan, of course, being a northern border state, also tends to have more seasonality in the employment gain from March to May. So a lot of special factors there.
Yeah, I mean, to throw a few of the numbers out there, they were as low as 76% down from that pre-COVID high, which is one of the highest in the country for sure that we measured. And as of basically the last 2 weeks of May, they were back up in the 20% plus above where they were pre-COVID. So some of that being that seasonality, some of it that those jobs are coming back online and people are trying to catch up. So they're putting more manpower on them as well. So I would say that they're making a strong recovery from a very, very deep dip compared to some of the other parts of the country.
Thanks. Next question is from our good friend Mark Shaw. Is there anything in this new data that's most surprising to both of you?
All right, I'll give that a try. I guess even though I'm very much a data guy and want to believe data when I think it's good data, and I think what our members have been telling us is a very large sample. I don't know if I mentioned this. We had over 630 responses this time. We've had over 700, generally over 800 responses in our previous round. So that's pretty robust. And things that you would think would be consistent have been. So it's not that we're getting a hugely different sample each time. And so I think that the general story that it tells is that project halts and cancellations continue to be very significant. They've eased up somewhat, but what we can't see from this historical data is what's coming down the pike. And this is where I kind of put the data aside and go with my gut, and that says, you know, private owners have a lot of reasons to put off construction or say, we can't afford it. We don't see the demand yet. We need more certainty about how well the economy is going to open up. And we do have certainty of a negative kind that state and local budgets, whether they're specific to highways or they're for broader things like parks and office buildings, those budgets are really going to be slammed, often starting in 2 weeks from now when they roll into the next fiscal year, and they have to finish that year with a balanced budget. It's always easier to put off a construction project that hasn't started than to lay off workers, cut their hours or pay, or stop benefits to people who are receiving them. So I guess very broadly, no, I'm not surprised by what we've seen now, but it doesn't mean that what we've seen in way of improvement is going to continue.
Yeah, I'll add a few bits of color to that. I think one of the things that was most interesting to me, not necessarily surprised me, was as we started to dive into these metro areas. The fact that a place like Dallas, for the most part, never really dipped below that pre-COVID level. Even coming into Memorial Day weekend was still almost at pre-COVID level. So that was very interesting to me, and how they've been able to keep all of those projects going, and just even like I said before, you're going to have projects that are going to happen inside of existing facilities that the owners may tell you, even though there's no shelter in place order, we just don't want you here, right? The other thing that I would say is an interesting piece is, you know, as we dive into some of these other metros like Seattle, how they have kind of turned that corner, and we can look at the Seattle versus Washington as a whole, right? And that those numbers are starting to change in those areas. That's just been very interesting to me, and we look to add more metro areas as we continue to grow, and we make sure that we have enough population of projects and things like that to be able to provide data. But that's been very interesting to me, and much like Ken said, like, this is what is happening on projects that are still going. What's going to be really interesting is to start to look forward on things like project starts and the ability to understand like how many new projects are actually starting versus how many were expected to start based on last year's numbers. Are we seeing a significant slowdown there? And that's something that we're diving into a lot right now.
I'm here.
You're muted, Brian. There you go.
I was trying to chew gum and walk at the same time. Sue from Como Radio in Seattle wanted to know any observations on the Seattle market, especially since it was the place that had really one of the first cases of COVID in the U.S. How is Washington State's handling of the virus helped or hampered the industry? And, you know, where do you think Seattle stands now? And do we have an outlook for that market?
So tough to give the outlook, but can definitely talk about, they were definitely one of the ones to fall very quickly, very early on the shutdowns, and their numbers were almost as low as Michigan, as we were mentioning before, at 71%, and Seattle was down in construction worker hours. Once they kind of started to relax those and put people back to work, they recovered pretty quickly. It went from 45% down in Seattle the week of April 26th to only 12% down the following week. So I'd say that shows that the construction industry was able to, once they were able to get back to work, mobilize pretty quickly, come together and figure out how they were going to work safely on job sites and actually get people back to work. To a point now, as that last week of May 31st that we're looking at, they're about 5% below. Now, we would expect that this time of year is going to be a good building time there, so we would expect them to be above that level. So I don't think they've made that full recovery yet, but it'll be interesting to see the next couple of weeks how if they continue to grow above that pre-COVID level and to compare that against previous years as well.
Ken, did you have anything you wanted to add? All right. We'll give Chris the last word on that one. Ted wants to know if we have any sense of whether unseasonal weather has played into any of the numbers that we've gone through today. Oftentimes, construction is so dependent on the weather. Is that?
Well, another data source that I look at is the Census Bureau's monthly figures on construction spending put in place. They come out with a lag of a month and a day. So the latest figures we have are for April. We'll get May numbers and a final revision for 2019 totals on July 1st. The census figures did seem to show a big jump in highway spending in January through March of this year. And I suspect that was due in part to favorable weather conditions in many of the parts of the country that are usually slammed by snow, freezing weather, and early in the spring by floods. Last year, March of 2019 was a horrendous year for flooding in the upper Midwest, and as a result, a lot of highway work, not to mention agriculture, was delayed for months. This year, I think it's been more of a return to normal or even a bonus in terms of getting things done earlier. And we saw this in the BLS numbers on what they call heavy and civil engineering construction employment for January and February as well. Then things turned topsy-turvy, of course. And so I think at this point, the swings are so enormous, you can't sort out the influence of weather on these numbers.
And Chris, you didn't have anything to add on weather, did you?
No, I'll let Ken take that one.
All right, weather to speak on weather. And last question we've got from the participants is, does AGC or Procore, for that matter, know what the baseline municipal owner infrastructure budgets look like pre-COVID? And then, any sense of how hard those budgets are getting hit because of the fall off in tax revenues because of the coronavirus and related lockdowns?
I aside from the number I cited from the American Association of State Highway and Transportation Officials, they said that the highway agencies have lost a cumulative $49.95 billion of revenue for highway projects, or it may include transit and aviation also, but I think it's highway specific. I don't have that, but I know there are collections of state agencies for different types of spending. The National Association of State Budget Officers, for instance. I'm sure that those numbers are being gathered. I have not seen them.
Gotcha. With that, those are the last of the questions. I don't know whether Chris or Ken, you guys had any final comments before we wrap up for the day.
I was going to say thank you for having me again. Really excited to continue to share this information. And as I mentioned before, we're regularly updating this. So if you are looking to watch us on a week-by-week basis and continue to see some of those growths, those of you who are asking, like, what is the next 90 days? We have been on a pretty good cadence of basically weekly putting out updated numbers on our site. So you can follow along and not have to wait a month for the next update.
Fantastic.
And you want to give them a link, Chris? I know.
Yeah, sure. Procore.com/COVID-insights is our site that you can get right to specifically these maps and these data tables, and they're all hosted on our website for public viewing.
And I know Brian will give you some too. Let me just mention that I write a weekly one-page summary of economic news relevant to construction called the Data Digest. Be glad to add anybody to the email list for that. I'm ken.simonson@agc.org. Brian, I'll let you close it out.
All right, and wouldn't you know, this is the one time someone calls my landline, but just real quick, anything you want to follow along to at home, just visit us online at www.agc.org. Again, that's agc.org. We'll have all the information we've discussed, and we'll push out emails to everyone that we've got emails for of the content, and we're going to put up the slide deck that both Ken and Chris used onto our website as well, so you'll have that accessible. And this media briefing was recorded, and when we get the link process, we'll put it up on our website as well. With that, thank you, Chris and Ken, and thank you to the many participants who logged in, and for those of you who are watching us on Facebook Live, we appreciate it, and that is the end of this event. Thank you.